Hello, my name is Derek Atkins, and this is another episode of Saints and Sinners, the video channel that dives into the Bible to see what God has to say to us in today's world. When will the end of the world come? And what will be the signs that tell us that the end of the world is near? Countless people have asked these questions over many generations. For example, we have this clay tablet, which was written in Assyria back in around 2800 BC, on this tablet, we read this text: the earth is degenerating today. Bribery and corruption abound. Children no longer obey their parents. Every man wants to write a book, and it is evident that the end of the world is fast approaching. History is littered with countless predictions about the end of the world. For example, Martin Luther, who launched the Protestant Reformation, predicted that Jesus would return no later than 1600. And Christopher Columbus predicted that the world would end in 1658. And these predictions, like these and several others that I'm going to mention, have caused great disappointment to many people and have caused many others to have skepticism about biblical prophecies. Baptist preacher William Miller predicted on 4 different occasions that Jesus would return, and he gave 4 different dates for Jesus's return in 1843 and then in 1844. And thousands of people literally sold off everything they had and waited on mountaintops for Jesus's return. And then, of course, came what was known as the Great Disillusionment. Charles Taze, who founded Jehovah's Witnesses, also predicted that the end of the world would come on several different occasions. He predicted that that the end of the world would occur in 1914. When that didn't happen, he predicted it would come in 1918. And when that didn't happen, he then predicted that the end of the world would come in 1925. Even Sir Isaac Newton, who discovered gravity and helped develop calculus, predicted that Jesus would come back no later than 2060. Now, like many others, I have long had a deep interest in Bible prophecy. For example, when I was a teenager, I read many of Hal Lindsey's books, including his best-selling book, The Late Great Planet Earth. And so when I was a teenager, I was very excited about Jesus's return, and I eagerly looked forward to his soon return. So, like me, many of you may also have a deep interest in the question of when the end of the world will come, or when Jesus will come back. In fact, if you're watching this video, it's probably very likely that you are interested in precisely this question. So today, we're going to look at the question of, we're going to begin a series of videos about the signs of the time. And I'm going to be looking at the signs that will tell us when Jesus is coming back and so that we can be better prepared, and so that we will be ready for Jesus's return. So let's begin by looking at Matthew chapter 24, verses 1 through 3. In this passage we read, Jesus left the temple and was walking away when his disciples came up to him to call his attention to its buildings. "Do you see all these things?" he asked. "I tell you the truth, not one stone here will be left on another. Everyone will be thrown down." As Jesus was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately. "Tell us," they said, "when will this happen? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" This scene took place on Tuesday night during the Passion Week, or that is, the week that led up to Jesus's death. Earlier that day, Jesus and his disciples spent time in the temple, where he pronounced woes upon the Pharisees and Sadducees. After spending a full day in the temple, Jesus and his disciples were now on their way to Bethany, where they stayed during this week leading up to Jesus's death. So as they left the temple, the disciples began raving about how amazing the temple was. And they had good reason to be amazed, because the temple in Jerusalem was truly a remarkable structure. It literally dominated Jerusalem in Jesus's day and took 46 years to build. While the temple in Jerusalem was not one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, it was still a remarkable structure. In response to the disciples' excited admiration of the temple, Jesus tells them that one day the temple will be destroyed. At these words, the disciples then asked Jesus what the signs of his return would be and of the end of the age. And as always, Jesus drew his disciples' attention toward what is of eternal importance. In the rest of Matthew 24, Jesus gives us a number of signs that will tell us that his coming is near. However, when we look at these signs, we find that many of these signs have been taking place throughout history, including wars, famines, and earthquakes. There have been countless wars throughout history, many famines, and countless earthquakes. For example, the Black Death in the 13th century wiped out 30 to 60% of Europe's population, plus an estimated 25 million people in China and Central Asia. World War II killed 65 million or more people. So, how are we to understand these signs? The key to understanding these signs is found in verse 8, where Jesus says, "All these things are the beginning of birth pains." This is a very vivid picture that helps us to better understand these signs. When a woman is about to give birth to a child, she begins to experience birth pains. As the time for the childbirth draws closer and closer, the birth pains become more frequent and more intense. In the same way, as the time for Jesus' return grows closer and closer, these signs will grow in frequency and intensity. So how can we say that the events are growing in frequency and intensity, given that when we look at world history, we've seen some pretty intense events, such as Genghis Khan killing literally tens of millions of people as he sacked city after city after city. One way that events today are considerably more intense than previous events is that due to globalization, our world is now more connected than ever before. For example, let's compare COVID with the Black Death. Now, the Black Death was certainly far more destructive than COVID ever was, but the Black Death took literally decades to cross the Eurasian landmass. COVID, on the other hand, infected almost the entire world within 2 to 3 months. Another reason why events today are more intense than in the past is because the world population is far greater than it was in the past. A larger for example, today, in 1800 or so, the world population was at 1 billion people. Today, we have more than 8 billion people in the world. A larger population means that these global events that we're talking about now affect far more people than previously. One sad and ironic example of this reality is the fact that there are far more slaves today than there ever was when slavery was legal in the United States and in many parts of the British Empire. There is one more key I want to address that affects how we interpret Jesus' word in Matthew 24. And that's the parable of the fig tree. We find this parable in Matthew 24, verses 32 through 35. And this is what the parable of the fig tree says. Now, learn this lesson from the fig tree. As soon as its twigs get tender and its leaves come out, you know that summer is near. Even so, when you see all these things, you know that it is near, right at the door. I tell you the truth, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my word will never pass away. So there are two questions we need to answer about the parable of the fig tree. First, we need to know, how are we to interpret the fig tree in this parable? In other words, is this a general agricultural metaphor telling us that when we see the sign that Jesus speaks of earlier in Matthew 24, we'll know that his coming is near? Or does the fig tree more specifically represent the nation of Israel and the Jewish people? Okay, so that's the first question we need to answer about the parable of the fig tree. The second question we need to answer is, how should we understand the phrase, this generation? Now, as I considered the first question, I feel that there are two valid interpretations of the fig tree. The first interpretation is that the fig tree is simply a general metaphor, and that Jesus is telling us that when we see all these signs taking place, we can know that his return is coming very soon. The second interpretation is that the fig tree does represent the nation of Israel. And there is biblical evidence to back up this interpretation, because in the Old Testament, the fig tree does often represent the nation of Israel. As I said, I believe both of these interpretations are valid because in either case, the first interpretation will always be true. If the fig tree does represent Israel, then we can say that when we see the sign that Jesus spoke of, that his coming is very near, it's true. And if the fig tree doesn't represent Israel, then we can still say that when we see the sign that Jesus spoke of earlier, we can know that his coming is very near. But if the fig tree does represent Israel, then that has a major impact on how we interpret the rest of Matthew 24, because from AD 70 to 1948, for nearly 1900 years, Israel did not exist as a nation. But then, on May 14, 1948, Israel once again became a nation. If the fig tree does symbolize Israel, then that means Israel has an important role to play in the events leading up to Jesus' glorious return. The second question, how do we understand the phrase, this generation, is also a bit tricky because there are many different ways to measure a generation. For example, the Israelites spent 40 years in the wilderness, which suggests that one generation could equal 40 years. Then Psalms 90:10 says, the length of our days is 70 years, or 80 if we have the strength. If we take this verse as our standard, then 70 or possibly 80 years could equal a single generation. And if we go all the way back to Genesis 6:3, we read, then the Lord said, my spirit will not contend with man forever, for he is mortal. His days shall be 120 years. So, how long is a generation? Is it 40 years, 70 years, 80 years, or is it 120 years? The reality is, Jesus simply doesn't tell us how long a generation is. But we do know this. Jesus wants us to be ready for his return, whenever that will be. In the rest of Matthew 24, Jesus warns his disciples that no one will know the day nor the hour of his coming. And he warns us against being unprepared for his coming. So, how can we be ready for his coming? In the final verses of Matthew 24, Jesus tells a parable of a servant who is lazy and begins to beat his fellow servant because he doesn't know when his master will return. In fact, it is probably safe to say that this wicked servant probably didn't believe his master would ever return. And so when his master did return, he was found not doing his job, and his master punished him for failing to do the work he was given to do. So, how can we be ready for Jesus' return? By being faithful in doing the work he's given us to do, to live for him and to bear witness to his gospel message of salvation. And if you aren't yet a Christian, then I urge you to believe in the Lord Jesus Christ. In Acts 16:31, the Apostle Paul, in response to the question, sirs, what must I do to be saved? Replied, believe in the Lord Jesus and you will be saved. Next week, I will continue this series by talking about the first sign, which is false teaching. Now, but before I finish today's video, I want to mention a couple of things so that you'll know where I'm coming from as I continue this series on the signs of the times. First, I am a premillennialist. And that means I believe that Jesus will come back before the 1,000-year reign or the 1,000-year millennium. So I believe that Jesus will come back before he establishes his millennial kingdom. However, even though I'm a premillennialist, I also believe that the rapture will happen at the same time as Jesus's visible return. And so this means that I believe that everyone who is living on earth at that time will live through the tribulation, including Christians. Now, I know that many of you are probably believe that the rapture will occur before the tribulation, and that's okay. You know, if you're right and I'm wrong, I'm not going to be upset. But on the other hand, if I'm right and you're wrong, you might be in for an unpleasant surprise. So I just want to make that clear to you where I'm coming from, okay? So I look forward to seeing you again next week. If you like this video, please hit the like button. And if you want to be notified of future videos, please hit the subscribe button. And if you have any questions or comments, please write them in the section below. So I look forward to seeing you again next week when we will look at the first sign that Jesus gave that will herald his soon return.